Welcome to the program, comrades and friends. Global Weekly News, serial number 206. First item South African Leftist Conference. South Africa's progressive forces are converging. On 29th May 2026, a diverse array of socialist, communist, and pan Africanist organizations converged for the Conference of the Left. The conference motto is Building a Left Movement for Working Class and Popular Power. At a moment marked by deepening economic crisis, unemployment, austerity, and fragmentation within progressive politics, the gathering reflects an attempt to rethink the future of left politics in the country. The conference was organized by the South African Communist Party, Economic Freedom Fighters, the Pan Africanist Congress of Azania, Azanian People's Organization, Konto V Sizwe Party, the Socialist Party of Azania, Workers' Socialist Party, Independent Labour Party, key trade union federations, and as well as Marxist and Pan Africanist formations uh, they were there. The representatives were there. Guests and solidarity delegates from various countries have also attended. The social and economic conditions facing the working class can no longer be addressed through fragmented struggles, the conference recognized. In a pre conference statement, organizers argued that the crisis confronting workers and the poor is not temporary but structural. South Africa continues to face mass unemployment, rising living costs, deteriorating public services, and widening inequality despite the democratic transition of 1994. Political freedom has not translated into material transformation for the majority, while the economy remains dominated by private accumulation and corporate power. Global capitalism has reorganized itself in ways that have weakened organized labor, informalization, precarious work, and attacks on trade unions have undermined working class power, while progressive movements remain divided across parties, unions, and community organizations. The conference attempted to rebuild a common forum through which left organizations can coordinate around shared working class objectives. Opening the conference, South African Communist Party General Secretary Soli Mapaila pointed out, we are different political organizations. We are not going to dissolve our independent political organizations. We are creating a platform of common coordination of the working class agenda. He further urged humility and mutual respect among progressive forces, acknowledging that no single organization possesses all the solutions. Julius Malema, leader of the economic freedom fighters, highlighted the absurd contradictions of modern society as follows. Humanity has never had better scientific knowledge, greater productive potential, uh, or greater technological sophistication than it does today. Yet, billions of people continue to exist in conditions of insecurity, deprivation, violence, and despair because society remains controlled by the private accumulation of profit rather than the fulfillment of basic human needs. Whether a permanent united front or a revolutionary council, coordinated campaigns, or a broader movement for socialist transformation emerges out of the conference remains to be seen. Second item, comrades. Brazil approves 40 hours work week. The Chamber of Deputies approved in two rounds on 27th May the proposed amendment to the Constitution that ends the 6 into 1 schedule and establishes a weekly work schedule of 40 hours, 5 working days, and 2 days of paid rest. The text now goes to the Senate for analysis. Lula da Silva is the president of Brazil. He is playing a very good role in BRICS. The proposal was approved in the second round with 461 votes in favor and 19 against. In the first round, There were 472 votes in favor and 22 against. 2 months after the enactment, workers will be entitled to 2 paid days off per week. There will not be any salary cut after 40-hour work week is implemented. This guarantee applies even to already established minimum wages. For individual micro entrepreneurs, micro and small businesses, the impact of the change in working hours will be mitigated by government measures. Item number 3, comrades. US Congress resolves to end war with Iran. People power works. The US Congress, the US Parliament, or the US House of Representatives just passed a war powers resolution opposing Trump's unauthorized war with Iran, a major rebuke to another endless war fought without congressional approval. This victory didn't happen by accident. It happened because people across the country called organized, met with the lawmakers and demanded accountability. Now it is time for the Senate to act. Let us keep the pressure on and send this resolution to Trump's desk. Trump has the power to veto the resolution. No more illegal wars, no more blank checks for militarism. Well, this is United States of America. Item number 4, dictatorship of President of Bolivia. Bolivia's people have been protesting for weeks, demanding the resignation of Bolivian President Rodrigo Paz. The social movements are mounting pressure on the government. Protests erupted after the government attempted to pass a law that would repeal the exemption of land from seizure, a right won by farmers to prevent the loss of their source of livelihood due to debt or any other circumstances. Paz defended the decision, saying it would allow the poorest Bolivians to access credit, although the opposition saw the law as a mechanism to hand over land to large national and international capital interests. Bolivia is a country rich in natural resources such as natural gas, zinc, silver, lead, tin, gold, oil, as well as lithium, for which the country holds the world's largest reserves, a fact that has attracted the attention of major technology companies. Together with Argentina and Chile, Bolivia forms the so called lithium triangle, a strategic zone for large technology firms. Following the harsh crackdown, farmers, teachers, students, indigenous people, and other groups of citizens joined the protest, demanding improvements in their conditions. The unanimous call of the protesters is Paz must resign. The government has been reluctant to step aside. On the contrary, it has sought international support, particularly from the US, its main ally, as well as from other right wing governments in the region. On 26 May, Congress repealed a law that placed limits on the president's ability to declare states of emergency. The United Nations expressed concern over the situation in Bolivia. The UN Human Rights Office said all actions by security forces must strictly comply with the international human rights law. Any human rights violations by these officials must be investigated effectively. It is urgent to prevent further violence and seek powerful and democratic solutions. Comrades and friends, item number 5, Sudan. The Sudanese armed forces are closing in on Kurmuk in the Ethiopian border to recapture the strategic town in Blue Nile state from the Rapid Support Forces, a paramilitary group fighting the army in a war now in its fourth year. Having displaced over 1.4 crore people and plunged one half of the country's population into hunger, unleashing the world's worst health and humanitarian crisis. Item number 6, US imposes fresh sanctions on Iran. Iran condemned the US threats of war and sanctions against Oman over its alleged cooperation with Iran. calling it yet another sign of the moral bankruptcy of the US government and its policy making. The US imposed fresh sanctions on Iran on 28th May despite the ongoing peace talks in Qatar to end the war and hostilities. It is sanctioning numerous entities, individuals, and vessels that form the backbone of Iran's the so-called illicit oil economy, directly targeting the financial lifeline of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and Iran's military apparatus, the US State Department said in a statement. The sanction targeted several Iranian cargo ships involved in the transportation of petroleum products and over a dozen Iranian entities based in different parts of the world, including Hong Kong, Dubai, and Singapore, along with certain individuals involved in the export of petroleum products. A day earlier, the US had sanctioned the newly formed Persian Gulf Strait Authority, which Iran announced will manage traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. The US warned of sanctions against any entity or individuals found involved in any kind of financial transactions with the authority. We will not allow the Iranian government to increase its oil revenue for the purpose of reconstituting its armed forces and military capabilities, claimed Treasury Secretary, US Secretary, Treasury Secretary in a press release. These fronts, these fresh rounds of US sanctions followed the launch of military strikes in southern Iran, despite a ceasefire in place since April 8th. President Trump has withheld his signature on an agreement finalized on 28th May to extend the ceasefire for 60 days and lift certain restrictions on navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. Item number 7, comrades. Cuba denounces US oil embargo as an act of war. Speaking before the UN Security Council on 26th May, Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez stated that US decisions which amounted to an act of war could lead to a humanitarian catastrophe if they continue to be enforced. He called on the international community to intervene and allow Cuba to exercise its right to exist. The oil embargo that the US imposes on Cuba is equivalent in its effects to a naval blockade, which is an act of war and genocide that subjects the Cuban population to conditions that threaten their integrity and existence and constitute a cruel collective punishment that today causes deaths, as reflected in the doubling of the infant mortality rate from 4.0 to 9.9 per thousand live births, or the reduction in life expectancy for children with cancer from 85% to 65%, said Rodriguez. Cuba has been cut off from reliable access to fuel since December 2025, following January 3, when US forces attacked Venezuela and took the then President Nicolas Maduro and his wife Celia Flores as prisoners. US ordered the suspension of all crude oil shipments to Cuba, which relies heavily on hydrocarbons for the functioning of the country at nearly every level: electricity, health, education, production, transportation, trade, etc. At the end of January, US threatened to impose tax sanctions on any country that sells oil to Cuba. Only one Russian ship has arrived in all of 2026. Added to this is an economic and commercial blockade that has been in place in Cuba since the 1960s and which, together with the energy blockade, aims to destroy the revolutionary process that began in 1959. Rodriguez emphasized that if the US were to attack Cuba, It would be provoking a bloodbath. Thousands of Cubans would die defending their homeland and sacred values and causes. And young Americans would also die, dragged into violence by an imperialist neo fascist policy of domination, plunder, and conquest. A few days ago, the US justice system filed charges against Raul Castro, the revolution's highest ranking living leader, aged 95, for the downing of two aircraft in the 1990s that had entered Cuban airspace and, despite requests from the Cuban military, did not leave its territory. Thousands of Cubans protested against this move in Havana before the US embassy. Cuban Foreign Minister Rodriguez said, Cuba is not a threat to the US. It is US that constantly threatens our people with military aggression and through its punitive measures causes severe harm to Cuban families. Rodriguez emphasized that his government remains open to dialogue and to welcoming US businessmen and tourists to strengthen the deep and historic ties that unite the people of America and Cuba. However, he also stated that if a military attack were to occur, Cuba would respond. Let no one doubt that should the moment arrive, the people of Cuba will fight to the bitter end. Homeland or death, we shall overcome. Eighth item comments. China calls for a revitalized United Nations. UN Security Council high-level meeting was convened on May 26 at China's initiative. Around 20 countries participated in the discussion. Foreign Minister of China Wang Yi emphasized that despite its recent failures, the UN remains the most authoritative and legitimate body in the multilateral security system and a cornerstone of the rule based international order. He underlined the need for its revival and revitalization with timely reforms to address problems the UN is facing and to make it relevant and effective. The meeting was also addressed by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He noted that the respect for international law has dangerously been eroded. Wang Yi criticized the unilateral military, economic, and political actions often undertaken by the United States and its allies, claiming such acts undermine the spirit of the UN Charter and warned that time for such attempts to dominate international affairs is over. Last item comments Israel's attack on Lebanon. The death toll of people killed in Israeli attacks on Lebanon since 2nd March has risen to 3,213 with 9,737 wounded. Thank you, comrades. Lal Salam. See you next week.